Oh, it's already recording. Hello, friends. That one caught me off guard. It's Aunt Nikki of your Story Hour. How are you guys doing today? It's time for me to start the new book. Uncle John has already read some, The Mallards and Their Neighbors by Neil Wayne Northey. We're going to read chapters 3 and 4 today. These were books that I read or was read to as kids, and I remembered the Bluebird story, but I don't remember all that happened in this book, so I'm looking forward to it. Let's get started. Chapter 3. Mrs. Mallard makes a discovery. Excuse me. I'm glad to hear that there is no hunting on the old homestead, said Mrs. Mallard after Mr. Bluebird had left. She felt quite relieved and quacked loudly as she started again to explore the duck pond. Quack, 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 she said, and flapped her wings against the water. She really made quite a noise, for Bud and Mary Smith heard it away up at the grand old house as they were leaving for school. I hear some wild ducks on the duck pond, exclaimed Bud. Let's go past there and count them. In a short time they were sneaking through the jungle thicket that grew along one side of the pond. At last Bud parted the bushes and looked out. There are only two, he whispered as he held up 2 fingers. A pair of mallards. I wonder what they are doing here, said Mary. They must be lost. Perhaps one of them is wounded, said Bud. I do wish they would stay, said Mary as they hurried on to school. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard did not know that they had been seen. Mrs. Mallard stood on her head in the water with her tail pointing straight up while she reached for a mouthful of oozy mud in which she hoped to find some grains of wild rice or a wriggly waterworm. Mr. Mallard swam around in wide circles looking for choice morsels to eat and with one eye watching for sharp toes. At last Mr. Mallard became tired. His wing was sore and he decided to rest a while. So he swam to a bunch of waving wild rice and tumbled bulrushes and crawled beneath them. He was entirely out of sight and felt quite safe unless Trailer the Mink came along. Mr. Mallard knew that Trailer the Mink seldom came out of his hidden den during the day, so he tucked his bill under his strong wing and went to sleep. Picture time. So Mrs. Mallard is the one with the tail up in the air. And it says, Mrs. Mallard stood on her head in the water with her tail pointing straight up. Mrs. Mallard was having too good a time to think about sleeping. She swam here and there while she explored the sheltered water lanes that wound in and out among the clumps of swamp grass and fuzzy cattails. Every place she went there was plenty to eat. The more she saw of the duck pond, the better she liked it. Only once did Mrs. Mallard think about going further northward. That was when a flock of ducks flew over. It was Sawbill the Meringuer and some of his friends. Mrs. Mallard quacked loudly to attract his attention. She thought perhaps he might like to rest and stop. But Sawbill the Meringuer was not quite ready to stop for that day. You see, he was not much interested in such things as waving wild rice to eat. Sawbill was fond of fish. His bill had sharp points on each side like teeth of a saw, with which he caught fish, and he ate so many that his flesh was fairly flavored with them. He was like the person who smokes so much that he smells like tobacco smoke. Sawbill the Meringuer knew where there was a lake that held many fish, so he hurried on, as if he had not heard Mrs. Mallard's invitation to stop. A little later 2 more ducks flew over quite low. They were Mrs. and Mr. Spoonbill. Again Mrs. Mallard quacked an invitation to stop. When Shoveler the Spoonbill heard it, he called to Mrs. Spoonbill. They turned and circled back to the duck pond. Quack, 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 said Mrs. Mallard. This is a nice place to stop. Here's a picture. And it says, Sawbill the Meringuer was it's a funny one I struggle with, was fond of fish, and his bill had sharp points on each side to help him catch them. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Spoonbill were floating lightly on the water near Mrs. Mallard, and squirting soft mud through the comb-like strainers on the sides of their broad bills. Shoveler the spoonbill had a funny way of eating. First he filled his large spoon-like bill with oozy mud or floating things. Then he strained this mouthful by working water through it. If the strainers held anything in his mouth that he liked, after the water had washed away the mud, he swallowed it. Perhaps that was his way of washing his food before he ate it. It was not long until Mrs. Mallard and the Spoonbills were good friends, and they swam along together exploring the duck pond. Halfway around the duck pond they saw a sheltered water lane that seemed to lead into a sheltered little cove. Mrs. Mallard swam into it and looked around. It did not take her long to see that it suited her exactly. On all sides were fuzzy cattails, waving wild rice, and swamp grass. There was an open space in the center lane, enough for fluffy ducklets to play in, and back from the water was a grassy bank with brush where Mrs. Mallard could build a nest. Yes, the place suited Mrs. Mallard exactly, and she started back to tell Mr. Mallard about it. She did not wait to swim back, but arose in the air, and in a few moments her strong wings had carried her to the place where she had left Mr. Mallard sleeping. "Quack, quack, quack, quack," she called in a loud voice, and soon she heard Mr. Mallard's low voice coming from among the fuzzy cattails. You may be sure it did not take long for her to tell Mr. Mallard about the sheltered little cove. Soon they were swimming back to it, with Mrs. Mallard ahead, quacking excitedly. "I know you'll like it, I know you will," she said. Mrs. Mallard reached the sheltered water lane and turned in, followed closely by Mr. Mallard. They found the spoonbills still enjoying a feast of the things that grew in the sheltered little cove, and soon Mr. Mallard was acquainted with them also. "I believe we'll stay right here for this summer," said Mrs. Mallard. "I think we shall too," said Mrs. Spoonbill. That is how the Mallards and the Spoonbills happened to be neighbors at the duck pond on the old homestead. Chapter 4. Redwing the Blackbird Moves In. Redwing the Blackbird was a jolly fellow. In the fall he had joined a large flock of his gentleman friends, and they had played and had sung together all winter. They had flown from place to place, sometimes here and sometimes there, as if they had not a care in the world and nothing to do but to travel. They enjoyed seeing new places. Usually they selected a swamp from their stopping place, where there was plenty of fuzzy cattails and tumbled bulrushes for them to perch on. Mrs. Blackbird and the other lady blackbirds had gone south, but Redwing and his friends were never in a hurry to leave in the fall. They were never in a hurry to go anywhere, for that matter. If the weather was not too severe, they sometimes stayed in the chilly Northland until merry little snowflakes lay so deep upon the weeds that Redwing could find little to eat. Then he and his friends would fly away towards the sunny Southland for a while, but they were likely to return to the chilly Northland with the first hint of fair weather. Redwing and his friends had been playing together for months, flying from place to place. One day, after Mrs. Blackbird arrived, they spied a sheltered little cove on the edge of a small lake where fuzzy cattails and swamp grasses were plentiful. Of course, they stopped to investigate, and the place suited Redwing and a few of his friends so well they decided to stay. Not that Redwing and Mrs. Blackbird were ready to start nest building then. Oh no, Redwing was never in a hurry to build a nest, any more than he was in a hurry to do anything else. Sometimes it was June before Mrs. Blackbird built her nest, and even then Redwing was not much help with the family work. Perhaps the reason that Mrs. Blackbird did not build a nest sooner was that she was waiting for the new fuzzy cattails to grow longer. You see, Mrs. Blackbird likes to build her nest over the water, and usually she used the fuzzy cattails in which to build it. Perhaps she waited until the new ones were high enough for shelter. It would be hard to say why Mrs. Blackbird chose to build her nest over water, for it certainly seems as if that was a dangerous place for wee blackbirds to live. What if one of them should have fallen out of the nest? It may have been that Mrs. Blackbird was vain and liked to build her nest where she could see her reflection in the water. More than likely she built it there so Hunting Cat and other prowlers could not get into it, for Mrs. Blackbird really had little to be vain of about as far as looks were concerned. Her streaked brown coat was very common-looking indeed, and she could not sing. She did not have the shining black coat and flashy red wing patches that Redwing had. It is no wonder he liked to spread his wings when he sang and to display the scarlet marks that looked very much like the stripes on a soldier's coat sleeve. No, it was not yet time for the blackbirds to start housekeeping, so they flitted about from one fuzzy cattail to another and explored their new home. That is what they were doing when they met the Mallards, for of course the sheltered little cove that Redwing had found was the same one where the Mallards were living at the duck pond. There's a picture of Redwing and the Mallards, and it says, "Oka-lee!" sang Redwing the Blackbird when he first met the Mallards, which was his way of saying, "Hello there, neighbors." I bet you that's the next sentence I'm going to read. "Oka-lee!" sang Redwing the Blackbird when he first met the Mallards. That was his way of saying, "Hello, neighbors." "Quack, quack, quack, quack," said Mrs. Mallard, and right away they both knew they would be good friends. How long do you plan to stay here?" asked Redwing, for he was not expecting that the Mallards would stay all summer. "Oh, we are living here now," replied Mrs. Mallard. "You see, Greenhead was shot through the wing and could go no further." Greenhead was Mrs. Mallard's favorite name for Mr. Mallard. See, he's got a green head. "Then we shall be neighbors all summer," said Redwing, "for I expect to live in the sheltered little cove." "Yes, and have you met Shoveler and Mrs. Spoonbill?" said Mrs. Mallard. "They will be our neighbors also. They have gone over to explore the little river today." "I have not seen them," said Redwing, "but I shall be glad to meet them." "Perhaps you would find them if you flew over to Little River," said Mrs. Mallard. "I believe I will," replied Redwing, and away he and Mrs. Blackbird flew. Redwing liked Little River almost as much as he liked the sheltered little cove. He found jungle thickets and tall grasses and rushes in places growing along its bank. There were quiet pools where water flowed slowly past broad bends, and it was one of those that Redwing found the spoonbills. They were enjoying a feast of good things that they found along the bank. "Oka-lee!" sang Redwing the Blackbird. "Chack, chack!" said Mrs. Blackbird. Of course the Spoonbills were glad to see them and to hear that they were going to be neighbors during the summer. "I am sure we shall get along nicely," said Shoveler. "Mrs. Mallard said that Mr. Bluebird told her that Bobby White told him that Farmer Smith did not permit hunting on the old homestead, and so we shall not be disturbed." As Shoveler said that, there was a terrific noise over at the duck pond. There could be no mistaking about it. It was the sound of a gun. It roared across the little valley, and its echo came back from the other side of the high cliff. "Oh, dear!" said Mrs. Spoonbill. "I do hope that the Mallards were not killed. I wish we could go and see if they were safe." "I see someone running across the green meadow from the grand old house," said Redwing, from his high perch on a drooping willow tree. "It must be Farmer Smith." "I hope he catches Terror the Hunter," said Shoveler. It was a long time before the Spoonbills and the Blackbirds ventured back to the duck pond. Well, we will have to catch up with them tomorrow. Take care.